Let's take a close look at the dialog elements and their properties. AcroDialogs provides a palette of 14 elements. They can be divided into 3 categories. The active elements, meaning that a user can interact with them by clicking or typing. Static elements that provide simple graphical information. And organizational elements that help us arrange the other elements on the dialog. You'll notice that some of these elements fit into more than one category because they can be used in more than one way. There is also one element that is not listed here, the dialog box itself. When I click on the body of the dialog box properties are displayed in the Properties panel on the right. All dialog box elements share a few common properties. The type, which is static and cannot be changed, and the width and the height. It is important to know that width and height are optional for most elements. These elements include the dialog box, the view, and the cluster because they contain other elements. Also, the static text, button, radio, checkbox, and all the OK buttons because these elements contain static text. In general, any element that contains something is automatically sized to fit its contents. All of the other elements require sizing because they don't contain anything that would automatically size them. The name property is used by all elements that contain static text. Right now, the name property is set to the default dialog title. I'll change it to some very long dialog box title text. And when I hit enter, you can see the title is now too long to fit into the dialog and is clipped on the right. The dialog box is not sized according to the size of its title, but purely on the size of its contents, or the sizing parameters. This name value cannot be changed while the dialog is running. It's purely static and must be defined before the dialog is run. However, as we'll see, other elements that use the name property may or may not change this value at runtime depending on the nature of the element. All of these properties, font, bold, and italic, are shared by elements that contain text. These are the only properties that can be set for text, and they are not as helpful as you might think. For example, there are only 3 font choices: default, dialog, and palette. The default font cannot be changed by the italic and bold properties. These properties do work, however, for the dialog and palette fonts. The palette font is a slightly smaller version of the dialog font. These fonts are the default system fonts, so if on your system you were to change the title bar font text to blue, then the text in the title of the JavaScript dialog will be blue. There's no way to change it specifically for the JavaScript dialogs. And another issue is that bold and italic do not always work. I'm not quite sure of the exact reasons for this, but it seems to be related to the version of Acrobat and possibly the system on which it's installed and the font selection. The first tab property is only used by the top level dialog. It is the 4-character ID of the first element in the tabbing order. And the final dialog property is the variable name. This is the variable name that will be used in the script for the dialog object definition. It is always defaulted to OJS dialog. You can keep this name just as long as there are no other dialogs defined within the same context. If you're using multiple dialogs within the same JavaScript context, then you'll need to rename it. Now let's take a look at the properties on the static text object. You'll notice that several of the properties here are the same as for the dialog: the type name, the width and height, and the name property, which is the value of the static text. And since this element contains text, it has the font, bold, and italic properties as well. But that is where the similarity ends. For example, all dialog elements have an item ID property. This is the item's unique ID, and it must be 4 alphanumeric characters that begin with a letter. It can't begin with a number, and it can't contain any punctuation characters, not even an underscore. This ID uniquely identifies the element for any and all operations that are applied to that element. And all elements also have an alignment property. The alignment determines how the element will be displayed within its container. The container for this static text element is the dialog itself, which is set up to automatically stack elements vertically and align them on the left. I'll add a couple of more static text elements so we can see this better. Notice that the alignment property for the new elements is not set, and so they default to the alignment of their container, which is on the left-hand side. To show how the alignment works, I'll set the alignment value to something different for each one of the static text elements. I can choose between left, center, right, and fill. We'll talk about fill later. And there you can see how each one of the elements is distributed based on its own special alignment. The next property is multi-line. This property is used by both the static and the edit text elements. For static text, however, the only thing this property does is draw a sunken border around the text. I can change this text on this element to display a new line, and then I'll resize it so that we can see the second line, that it displays multi-line text. However, it displays the same even if multi-line is turned off. So it's purely a visual thing for static elements. The next property is enable. This property is common to all interactive elements and to the static text. Turning it off displays the text as grayed out or inactive. This is a purely visual change to help with the user interface. The last two properties are the initial value and the variable name. Static text is not an input item. The static text can, however, be dynamically changed using a script at runtime, which is why the initial value and variable name are provided. The initial value overrides the name value. The static text element is automatically sized to the name value, but the value set with the script, in this case the initial value, does not have an effect on the element size. Now let's clean this up and take a look at an interactive element, the edit text element. This element shares many of the same properties as the static text element, but it also has some additional properties. For example, all interactive elements have the next tab property. This is the next element in the tabbing order. If it's not set, then Acrobat decides the tabbing order, which is the order of the elements as they appear in the dialog object definition. For all interactive elements, the enable property enables or disables user input. All interactive elements also have a variable name property. This is the name of the dialog object variable that will initialize the element and get the value from the element. The edit text element also has some special properties. The password property causes all the entered text to be replaced by asterisks, so no one can see the actual entered text. The read-only property blocks the field from user input, but unlike the enable property, it doesn't gray it out. And it also allows the user to select text. And the spin edit property forces the element to be a number-only field and adds up-down arrows. Since this element doesn't contain anything that would force it to be sized, there are some special things about its sizing. The minimum height for this field and for any other interactive element that contains entered text is the height of a character. Its width, however, can be 0, which is why you need to set the width of this element, which is why it's automatically set to 35. You can make it smaller than 35, but in order for you to be able to use it within the design space, it's a good idea not to make it too small. Now, let's take a look at the elements that organize other elements, the view and the cluster. These elements are similar but have important difference. The most obvious is that the view is invisible and the cluster contains a border and some text. But there are other differences as well that we'll see in just a bit. Let's look at the view first. Its properties contain the type name, item ID, width, height, and alignment, just like all the other elements we've seen. But you might be wondering why it also has an enable property, since of course it is invisible. But this property is not for the view, it's for the things that are inside the view. I'll move both the static text and the edit text elements into the view. And then, when I set the enable to false, you can see that the elements inside the view are disabled. Enabling and disabling is done from a script, so you can use a view to enable and disable many elements at the same time, which makes dialog scripting more efficient. The align children property is one we haven't seen before. unless of course you've already watched the videos on manually scripting a dialog, which I would strongly suggest. It controls how the elements inside the view are arranged. It defaults to left, but we can also change it to any of these other values. Left, center, and right values align the elements vertically and on, of course, the left, center, or right. But they do not override the alignment values of the individual elements. The top and row values align the elements horizontally. Now we have a standard input field arrangement with the label on the left and the input field on the right. The cluster has nearly all the standard properties plus the properties for text since it displays a text string. And of course the align children property because it is a container. But there are two notable differences from the view. First, there is no enable property. Unlike the view, a cluster cannot be enabled or disabled. I don't know why, but this is just something Adobe decided to do. Second, the default alignment for the cluster, not the align children parameter, but the alignment for the cluster is align fill. The align fill property means that the width of an element is extended out to the width of its container. So let's change the view back to left alignment and resize the dialog to something very large. You can see that the view remained the same minimum width of its contained elements, whereas the cluster grew to the width of the dialog, which is its container. This is different from literally every other dialog box element except for the OK cancel buttons, which all have a default alignment of right. I'll change the cluster's alignment to left, and now you can see it's at its minimum size. Of course, it doesn't contain any elements, so its minimum size is based on its text. And that covers all the basic properties for elements. There are, of course, more elements, and there are some special properties for some of these other elements, for example, the image element and the list box elements, but we've covered 90% of what you need to start using properties, and these other elements will be covered in later videos.